For today's video, let's dig back into the past. Was the Black Plague a bioweapon? A recent genetic study of bacteria from victims of the plague has revealed some interesting insights into the origins of one of history's most devastating diseases. Some scientists are saying this could be proof that the Black Death was an early bioweapon, but others say this is still up for debate. So let's talk about it. Back in 2022, researchers reported the results of their study on the origin of the bacterium that causes the plague Yersinia pestis. Their findings were based on DNA analysis of 316 plague victims from the UK, who died during 3 different outbreaks between the 13th and 17th centuries. And they found something really weird. The samples from 2 of those outbreaks, which happened in the 1600s, contained almost identical bacterial DNA. The researchers say these 2 outbreaks may have been caused by the same plague bacteria strain, which means the disease stuck around in Europe for hundreds of years after the big one in the 1300s. However, before this study, scientists believed the plague had disappeared after its initial outbreak, only to re-emerge in the 1600s. This idea that the plague came and went in just a few decades is also what we used to think about other major plagues that happened before the modern era, like the Antonine Plague, which struck Rome in the 2nd century, and the Justinianic Plague, which hit in the 6th century. But now we know that those plagues lasted for hundreds of years too. So the question is, if the plague stuck around for so long, where did it go when it wasn't causing pandemics? Well, one possibility is that the plague bacteria continued to cause smaller outbreaks, but they just kind of flew under the radar. Or the bacteria could have been living in its animal hosts, like rodents, without causing illness, only to jump back into humans every once in a while. In fact, scientists are pretty sure that's how the plague bacteria managed to stick around for so long, because they found that the plague bacteria have a mutation that allows them to survive in cold environments, which would have helped them survive in temperate places like Europe through the winter. But that mutation makes them a little bit less deadly. So maybe the plague was always around, but it was harder to notice because it wasn't constantly causing mass death. But there's another explanation for these new findings. Some scientists hypothesize that the plague bacteria were being purposely introduced into human populations, which is why the bacteria is so similar between the plague victims from the 1600s. And this is what has led people to start calling the plague a bioweapon. But this isn't the first time someone has suggested that. People have speculated since at least the 17th century that the plague was unleashed on purpose, possibly as revenge for the Black Death. Some blame the recently Christianized Mongols, thinking they released the plague bacteria from fleas they carried with them as they traveled across Asia. Others blame the British for spreading the plague to China, or even blame Jews for poisoning wells. All of these accusations led to violence against the groups that were being blamed for spreading the plague. But if the plague was a bioweapon, who would have made it one? To answer that question, the researchers looked at where in the genome the cold-adapted mutation occurred. They found that the mutation was located near a gene called ALABA, which helps the bacteria become more virulent. Usually when a microbe acquires a mutation, it will test out that new version of the gene and then keep the change if it helps the microbe survive and reproduce. But sometimes a new version of a gene can be harmful to the microbe, and in that case the microbe will revert back to the original version of that gene, and that seems to be what happened here. It looks like this version of the plague bacteria evolved from a less virulent strain and gained some virulence along the way. But somewhere along the line, probably when it started infecting humans, the bacteria reverted back to a less virulent form. And that leads us back to the question of whether the plague was a bioweapon. Microbes constantly develop mutations. That's actually how antibiotic resistance emerges. However, that doesn't mean a specific mutation is certain to occur. Some mutations are more likely than others, so researchers wondered if whoever made the plague more deadly also tried to stop it from becoming less deadly. After all, if you're going to put a lot of effort into making a super deadly plague, you don't want your hard work undone by some random mutation. To investigate this, the team turned to microbiology. They grew up cultures of Yersinia pestis and exposed them to conditions that mimic what's inside the body, like low oxygen levels and 37 degrees Celsius, normal body temperature. They compared the growth and virulence of the bacteria from the plague victims with the more modern strains, and they found that modern strains of plague bacteria can't survive well under these conditions. And the ones that do survive tend to lose their virulence pretty quickly. So, either the cold-adapted mutation arose multiple times independently, or the plague bacteria were being continuously selected for. In other words, someone was intentionally growing and reusing the plague bacteria as a bioweapon. Now, the authors of this paper aren't saying that the plague was definitely a bioweapon. They just say that this evidence can't be ignored. It's possible that plague bacteria were used as a weapon. And if that's the case, this might not be the only time that's happened. Other historical accounts describe similar strategies to inflict harm on enemies. For instance, in the 1340s, during the siege of Kaffa in Crimea, the Mongol army reportedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls. If this story is true, it would be one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. But we don't know if the plague was a bioweapon. And if it wasn't, we still don't know how it stuck around for so long. There are other questions too. Like, how exactly was the plague spread during the siege of Kaffa? And were the Mongols the first to come up with the idea of biological warfare? These questions are going to take more research to answer. And as scientists learn more about the plague and its effects, we can better understand not just the past, but the world we live in today. When plagues hit in the modern era, like the bubonic plague in Madagascar in the 1990s, we can stop them from turning into pandemics. But that's partly thanks to knowledge we gained studying ancient plagues like the Black Death. The question of whether the Black Plague was a bioweapon remains a fascinating mix of history, science, and speculation. While the evidence points strongly toward natural causes, the possibility of early biological warfare tactics during that era raises important questions about how we interpret history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, subscribe, and hit the bell for more thought-provoking content. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the past.